The garrison at Fort Renner sat above the Kansas plain like a fist pressed into dry earth, and in the autumn of 1878 it released what it no longer wanted. What it released on a Tuesday morning with the frost still on the parade ground was a woman named Nora Voss. She had not been a soldier. She had not been a laundress or a cook, though she had cooked more meals for more officers than she could reckon. She had been the post surveyor's daughter, and then the post surveyor's apprentice, and then, after her father's death from a river fever the summer before, simply an inconvenience. Colonel Parrish had given her 30 days and then 30 more, and then he had handed the matter to his adjutant, who had handed her a bill for 7 months of quarters and told her the balance was due on the 1st of October. She had paid it. She had paid it with every cent her father had left, minus the $32 she kept in the lining of her coat, and she had walked off the post with his chain case over one shoulder and a canvas satchel over the other, and she had not looked back at the walls. She was 26 years old. She knew more about Kansas land than most men twice her age. She had $32. What she also had, and what the adjutant had not thought to inventory, was 8 years of training in the particular discipline of seeing ground the way it actually lay. Her father, Edmund Vass, had come to survey work by way of a military cartography unit in the late war, and he had brought home from that experience a conviction that the commonest sin in his trade was not dishonesty, but haste, the willingness to extend a straight line across irregular ground rather than follow the ground's own argument. He had taught Nora to chain before she was 15 and to close a survey before she was 17, and by the time she was 20, she could calculate a bearing correction in her head while the chain was still being laid out across the grass. He had also taught her to read the record before she read the field, because a lie in a document and a true line on the ground were never far enough apart that a careful person could not find where they diverged. She had spent the 2 years before his death keeping his notebooks, rerunning his traverse calculations, and accompanying him on every commission within riding distance of Fort Renner. She knew the section corners for 40 miles in every direction. She knew which ones had been properly witnessed and which were estimated. She knew the benchmarks and the drainage patterns and the points where limestone shelf broke through the Kansas clay and changed the character of the ground. That knowledge was in her body, the way the muscle knowledge of a craft lives in the hands, and the adjutant and Colonel Parrish, and none of the men at that auction knew she was carrying it. The town of Hadler Wells sat 3 miles south of the fort along a rutted wagon road, and it was not much of a town. A feed merchant, a dry goods store, a land office that was also a barber shop, a livery, and a saloon that served food on Sundays. Nora had been in Hadler Wells twice, both times on her father's survey business, and she knew a man named Orville Crate ran the land office and that he was sharp with numbers but careless with maps, which her father had noted in his ledger with a pencil underlining. What Nora did not know walking into Hadler Wells on that October morning was that 3 weeks earlier, a detail of soldiers from Fort Renner had vacated a piece of ground half a mile east of town, and that the ground had been posted for auction. She learned it from a handbill tacked to the feed merchant's door. The handbill said 1 earthen dugout dwelling, 112 square yards of excavated ground, 1 timber frame outbuilding, all improvements thereon, would be sold at public auction on October 7th, 1878, at the Hadler Wells Land Office. Minimum bid $6. Nora read it twice. She had spent 2 years helping her father survey the land within 5 miles of Fort Renner. She knew the ground east of town. She knew it sat above a low limestone shelf, and that there was a spring-fed seam running through the clay not 30 yards from where the Army had put their first encampment, back in 1873, before the fort moved to higher ground. She knew that ground, and she knew the Army had dug there, and she knew they had left in what the handbill called, with a fine tidiness, an expedient manner of departure. $6. She had 32. If you have ever passed something the whole world calls worthless and felt a different pull entirely, you may understand something of what Nora felt standing at that door. Stay close to what she does next. The auction drew 7 men, and Nora. The men were a fence merchant from the next county, 2 cattlemen who had ridden over to see what the army had abandoned, a speculator from Dodge City who wore a suit the color of old mustard, the feed merchant whose door had held the handbill, and Orville Crate himself, who attended every auction in Hadler Wells on principle. The 7th man was a homesteader named Burl Hicks, who farmed the quarter section due north, and who stood with his hat in his hands and said nothing throughout. The speculator opened at $6. The fence merchant bid 7. The speculator bid 8. One cattleman bid 9, then dropped out when the other raised to 10 and shook his head at 11. Nora bid 12. The speculator looked at her the way men looked at a horse that had spoken. He bid 13. She bid 14. He held at 15 and waited for her to stop. She bid 16. She watched him add something up behind his eyes, whatever the army ground east of town was worth to a man who sold things onward, and decide that 16 was more than that sum came to. He tipped his hat and stood back. The other men did not bid. The feed merchant looked at his shoes. Burl Hicks looked at the ceiling. She paid $16. Orville Crate wrote her name in his ledger and slid the deed across the counter and said, not unkindly, that the dugout had been occupied by a corporal and 3 privates, and he could not speak to the condition of it. She thanked him. She folded the deed into her coat with the remaining $16 and walked east out of Hadler Wells with the October light behind her and the pale, flat country opening up ahead. The ground was the color of old straw, and the grass had gone yellow-gray in the October cold. She found the outbuilding first, a 3-sided timber frame with a sod roof that had partly collapsed, used at some point as a stable for 2 horses, and left with grain chaff and old rope coiled on a nail. She noted that the timber was still sound where it had not been wet. She noted the rope. She moved east another 40 yards along the slight depression in the ground that marked the old army road, the wagon ruts still showing through the dead grass. The dugout entrance was set into a low rise, a doorway faced with rough-cut limestone blocks and fitted with a plank door that had been nailed shut from the outside. 3 nails driven hard, not locked, nailed. Men who lock a door mean to come back. Men who nail it mean to be done. Nora set down the chain case and opened it on the ground beside her. Her father's tools were there in their fitted leather slots, a 40-link Gunter's chain, a set of dividers, a marking pin, a small folding rule, a plumb bob on its string, and at the bottom in a flannel roll, the tools she had watched him use on every difficult structure he had ever surveyed. A flat pry bar, narrow-headed and 12 inches long, a claw hammer with a turned hickory handle, a punch, a cold chisel worn short from use. He had taught her to read the ground before she read the structure, because the ground does not lie the way a wall can lie. She read the ground. The limestone lip of the entrance showed no recent crumble. The nails in the door were new, driven within the last several weeks, and had not begun to oxidize in the October damp. 3 nails, standard 8-penny, the kind the army issued in their supply stores. The earth directly in front of the door had been disturbed and then smoothed, and when she knelt and pressed her palm to it, she felt the faint concavity of a filled excavation, perhaps a foot across and no deeper than her fist. Something had been buried in the threshold, something small. She did not dig for it yet. She lifted the pry bar and set its head against the first nail and drove it under with the heel of her hand and levered slowly. the nail groaning out of the wood in a long pull. The second nail came faster. The third resisted, the wood having swelled around it in the recent rains. And she worked the bar in 2 inches and pried with her full weight, and the nail let go with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and the door swung outward on leather hinges that had gone stiff. The air that came out of the dugout was not the cold of October. It was the older cold of earth sealed from light, a dark mineral cold that carried with it the smell of tallow candle and wet limestone, and the particular staleness of a space where men had lived and then stopped living. Nora held the door open and let the outside air move in for a time. She did not go in yet. She looked. The dugout was larger than she had expected. The army had dug well, 12 feet wide and perhaps 20 deep, with a vaulted ceiling of packed clay supported on 4 squared timber uprights and crossbeam with pine that had been rough sawn and was now dark with old lampblack. The floor was earth, packed hard from boots. There was a plank table along the far wall with 2 turn-leg stools. There was an iron stove in the near left corner, its flue pipe running up through the clay ceiling, the pipe sealed at the top with a tin cap that had held out the weather and explained why the interior was as dry as it was. There were 4 rope beds, their ticking stripped, the rope frames bare. There were wooden boxes along the near right wall, 6 of them, the kind the army used for dry goods, their lids still on. There was no lamp. There was no candle. There was no lantern. Men who leave in a hurry take their light. Nora went back to the outbuilding and found in the grain chaff on the floor a tallow stub 1 inch long pressed into a tin cup. She brought it to the dugout entrance, struck a lucifer from her coat, and lit it and carried it inside and set it on the plank table. The boxes were the first thing she opened. The army packed and labeled everything it owned, and these boxes had been labeled and then the labels had been removed, the paper torn away down to bare wood, leaving ghost rectangles of dried paste on the pine. Whatever had been written on those labels, someone had not wanted it read. Inside the boxes she found 3 wool blankets, government issue, neatly folded, 2 tin mess kits, both engraved with a capital letter that she took to mean a regimental designation, a set of copper-tipped tent stakes, a canvas roll of leather working tools, a brass sextant in a fitted oak case, the velvet interior molded exactly to its shape, the instrument itself in near-perfect condition, its mirrors clean, its arc unscratched. She held the sextant in the tallow light and thought about what a corporal and 3 privates had been doing with a sextant in a dugout east of Hadler Wells, and who among them had known to use it. A sextant was not standard Army issue for a basic garrison detail. It was a navigator's or a surveyor's instrument, expensive to obtain and calibrated for careful use. That it had been left behind, packed in its case and sealed in a labeled box with the label removed, told her something about the condition of the departure. Whatever had pulled these men out of this dugout, it had pulled them faster than they had planned. She set the sextant back in its case and opened the last box. At the bottom of the 6th box, wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth and then in a piece of canvas duck tied with waxed cord, she found a packet of papers. She did not unwrap the packet in the dugout. She brought it to the doorway where the October light was coming in, flat and pale, and she set it on the limestone threshold and worked the cord loose and opened the oilcloth with careful hands. The papers were 12 sheets of foolscap, closely written in a hand she recognized at once as a surveyor's hand, the figures precise, the margins used for calculation, the headers in a smaller block script. At the top of the first sheet in that block hand, she read the words, Plat Survey, Section 14 and Section 15, Renner Township, Ford County, Kansas, August 1878, and beneath that the name C.A. Pruitt attached. Underneath the header, a single line that stopped her cold. Variance noted, the line read, "Filed plat, General Land Office, Washington, August 1874. Differs from ground measurement in acreage by 310 acres. Discrepancy recorded in field notes. See attached chain calculations, 310 acres." She sat down on the limestone threshold with the papers in her lap and read every sheet twice. The tallow candle inside the dugout, burning down to a pool of pale wax behind her. C.A. Pruitt, corporal, had been the kind of man her father had been. Methodical, careful with his numbers, unable to let a bad measurement stand without noting it. What Pruitt had found in August of 1878, running a routine resurvey of the township sections adjacent to Fort Renner, was that the plat filed with the General Land Office in 1874 by a surveyor named Aldous Mend had misrepresented the acreage of Section 14 by 310 acres. The filed plat showed Section 14 as 640 acres, the standard square-mile section. Pruitt's chain survey showed it was 950 acres. The land in question was a broad, low-lying basin on the section's eastern edge that the 1874 survey had cut off at a straight-line boundary that bore no relation to the actual survey markers Pruitt had found in the field. 310 acres had been in the filed plat, simply erased from the record. The land had been homesteaded in 1875 by a family whose deed Pruitt's letter named. They had paid the General Land Office for 640 acres and received deed to 640 acres, but had in fact occupied 950. The extra 310 acres had no recorded owner, no price, no fee paid. What the fee would have come to in 1874, she calculated on the back margin of one of her own field notes, which she kept folded in her coat. Government land in that period sold at $1.25 per acre. 310 acres was $387.50, which was a substantial sum, sufficient to purchase a business or a reasonable house in any Kansas town. The question of where $387.50 had gone in August of 1874, when the plat was filed and the acreage was recorded at 640 rather than 950, was not a question the records could answer. It was a question for a different kind of inquiry. Pruitt's final sheet was a letter addressed to the post commandant requesting that the survey discrepancy be forwarded to the General Land Office for review. The letter had no signature. It had no date of transmission. It had not been sent. Instead, someone had nailed the door. Nora sat with the papers and the pale October sun on her face and thought about Aldous Mend. She had heard that name. Her father had heard it, had written it in his ledger with a single notation beside it. Those 3 words, "will not share fieldwork." She thought about a surveyor who would not share his fieldwork, who filed a plat in Washington in 1874, who had 4 years of quiet before a soldier with a gunter's chain found what he had done. She thought about the family farming 310 acres of land that had no recorded owner, no tax basis, no title, no protection. She thought about Pruitt and where Pruitt had gone, and why a man who wrote careful chain calculations had left Kansas without sending a letter he had already written. She folded the papers back into the oilcloth and tied the cord and put the packet in her satchel beside her father's folding rule. Then she went back to the threshold and knelt and dug with the narrow head of her pry bar in the small concavity she had felt earlier. 8 inches down, the bar struck tin. She worked around it with care and lifted out a tobacco box sealed with its own lid. Inside the tobacco box was a brass compass in a leather fob case. The personal kind a man carried through years of field work and wore smooth at the edges. On the inside of the fob case, inked in small letters that had not faded, she read the initials CAP, and beneath them, 1st Kansas Volunteer Infantry. She closed the compass and put it in her pocket. She went back into the dugout and let the last of the tallow gutter out, and stood for a moment in the cold dark of the place, and she let herself understand what she held. The question she carried out into the October light was not about the papers. It was about what the papers required of her. Her father had said a surveyor's job ends at the line. You measure it, you mark it, you record it. What happens after the line is recorded is not the surveyor's work. She had never fully believed him on that point. The family, whose name appeared in Pruitt's letter, farmed ground 4 miles east and a mile south. She knew that from 2 years of survey work on this county. She had met them once, in 1876, when her father had run a line across the northeast corner of their claim to settle a fence dispute with a cattle company. The father had offered them water and watched the chain work with quiet attention. He had daughters, the oldest perhaps 14 or 15 at the time. Nora walked. The farm sat at the edge of the basin Pruitt had measured, and the difference between the filed line and the true line was visible from the farm road if you knew how to read the ground. The filed line cut across a low swell and ended at a limestone outcrop that bore no witness mark. The true line, the one Pruitt had chained, ran 200 yards further east to a section corner post that had been set in 1873 and that the 1874 filing had simply ignored. Between those two lines lay 310 acres of low basin ground, good grass, with a spring-fed draw running straight through it that she could hear before she could see it. The father was splitting wood in the yard when she came up the road. He set down the maul and looked at her with the particular caution of a man who had learned to be careful about what the government next intended for him. His name was George Stout, and he was older than she remembered, the winters of the last 2 years having left their mark across his shoulders. She told him who she was. She told him her father had surveyed this ground. She took Pruitt's papers out of her satchel and set them on the fence rail, and she told him plainly, her voice level, that a surveyor had filed a false plat in 1874, that his deed said 640 acres, but a military resurvey done the past August said 950, and that the 310 acres on his eastern boundary had no recorded owner. George Stout looked at the papers for a long time. He looked at the chain calculations, line by line. He looked at Pruitt's unfinished letter to the commandant. He looked at the section corner numbers and the bearing notations and the closing error, which was less than 2 chains across a survey of that size and represented careful work. His oldest daughter came to the door of the house and stood there watching. Nora did not look toward her. George Stout said quietly that they had always watered out of that draw. She said she knew, and that he had a right to it that had never been written down. He was quiet for a moment. He asked what a right needed to be. She told him it needed to be filed and recorded. She asked him one question. She asked whether he had ever paid taxes on the full eastern extent of his ground, including the basin acreage beyond the filed line. He had. He had paid on it every year since 1875, he said, because he had always known where his ground ran, whatever the paper said, and he had paid the county assessor on the full spread rather than dispute a line nobody came out to measure. Tax receipts were documents. Documents were proof. A man who had paid on ground for 3 years had a record that a false plat could not simply erase. She thanked him and walked back toward Hadler Wells with the October wind at her back and the basin ground spreading out on her left. Good grass, well watered, The kind of land a man built a family on if the records were right. She was tired, and her boots had collected clay from the draw, and she had 6 miles of walking in her legs by the time she reached town. She went to Orville Crate's land office and asked him whether the county tax records for Section 14 were held here or at the county seat. He told her the county seat, Dodge City, 40 miles west. She asked him, in the same breath, whether he was acquainted with a surveyor named Aldous Mend. Orville Crate set down his pen and looked at her over his spectacles. He said Aldous Mend had sold his surveying practice in 1876 and moved to Wichita, where he held an interest in a land brokerage. She nodded and said she would need to go to Dodge City. She left on the morning stage, which cost $1.75, and took 4 hours on a road that seemed designed by someone with a lasting grudge against wheel axles. She sat with her satchel in her lap and Pruitt's papers inside her coat and watched the Kansas plain go by, flat and wide and the color of dried hay in October. And she thought about the geometry of a false line. A surveyor who misrepresents 310 acres does not do it by accident. The 1874 Mend survey had required someone to ignore a corner post that had been set in 1873, a post still standing that she and her father had noted in their own fieldwork without understanding its significance, because they had not yet seen the 1874 plat. The post and the plat told 2 different stories, and the post was iron and older and had not moved. At the county seat, she went to the assessor's office in the east wing of the courthouse and asked for the tax records for Section 14, Renner Township, for the years 1875 through 1877. The clerk produced the ledger books. She spread them open on the counter and read them with the same attention she had given Pruitt's calculations, line by line, year by year. The records confirmed what George Stout had told her. He had assessed and paid on 950 acres every year at the full county rate. The acreage stated plainly in his filings, not 640, 950. The county had accepted his payments and entered them without question, because the county did not concern itself with the discrepancy between its own tax rolls and the general land office plat, only with whether the money came in. She asked the clerk for paper and a pen, and she wrote 2 letters at the counter. The first was to the commissioner of the General Land Office in Washington, and it stated that a survey discrepancy had been discovered in Section 14, Renner Township, Ford County, Kansas, affecting 310 acres, and that supporting chain survey calculations, the file plat, and county tax records were being forwarded. She wrote it in the plain, documented style her father had taught her, with the calculations referenced by page number and the corner post described with its 1873 setting date and its measured location as recorded by Pruitt. She stated the variance figure precisely and the method by which it had been determined, and the name of the surveyor whose 1874 filing she believed to be in error. She did not state an accusation. She stated the measurements. The measurements were the accusation. The second letter was to the Kansas State Board of Examiners of Land Surveyors, with a copy of Pruitt's chain calculations and a summary of the variance between the 1874 filing and the 1878 resurvey, requesting that Aldous Mend's certification be reviewed. This letter was shorter. The chain calculations did the work. She did not write a letter to Aldous Mend. There was nothing to say to him that the records would not say more plainly. She sealed both letters and paid the postal fee and walked out of the courthouse into the thin November light, because October had ended while she was making her calculations, and the Kansas plain in November is a particular kind of vast and cold and indifferent to what any one person intends. She had $9 and some change left from the 16 she had started with, and she stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and counted it and found it sufficient. She went back to Hadler Wells on the afternoon stage and walked out to the dugout in the long blue dusk and built a fire in the iron stove with dead wood she gathered from the creek bank, and she sat with the stovepipe warmth rising around her and Pruitt's papers stacked on the plank table in the firelight, and she let herself be tired. The repairs took 3 days. She patched the sod roof of the outbuilding with cut grass and fresh clay, tamped into the gaps with the heel of her boot. She sealed the stove flue with a strip of tin she cut with her cold chisel from the lid of one of the supply boxes. She moved the oilcloth packet to the stovepipe shelf, where it would stay dry. She bought a cord of cottonwood from the feed merchant for $2 and banked the stove against the November cold. She slept on the rope bed with one of the government wool blankets and found that the earth, warmed from below and held by 2 feet of clay on every side, kept the heat of the stove through the night in a way no wood frame structure ever quite managed. She was still in the dugout when the reply from the General Land Office came, in the 3rd week of December, which was faster than she had expected. It was addressed to N. Vass, Hadler Wells, Ford County, Kansas, and it acknowledged receipt of the survey documentation and stated that a review had been opened and that the county tax records she had cited had been formally requested. There was a second letter, this one from the Kansas State Board of Examiners, which informed her that Aldous Men's certification had been suspended pending investigation. George Stout's corrected deed took until the following spring, passing through the General Land Office and the county recorder and the state courts in the slow, deliberate way of legal instruments that must account for everything they correct. Nora knew that, and she did not expect it to move faster than the records required. What she had not expected was what Orville Crate told her in January, standing in his land office with the barbershop smell of bay rum and soap around them, and the stove ticking in the corner. He told her that the General Land Office review had turned up a second discrepancy. In Section 22, 2 townships east, a similar pattern had emerged, a filed plat that cut a straight line across irregular ground and left a parcel of basin land without a recorded owner. A family named Decker had been paying taxes on the full acreage since 1876. The variance was 218 acres. The survey had been filed in the same year, by the same hand. Aldous Mend had not done this once. Orville Crate asked whether she would be willing to examine the fieldwork on Section 22. She said she would need a fee. He said they had mentioned that, yes. The county paid her $8 a day, which was what they paid a man of comparable training, and she accepted it without comment. She ran the Section 22 chain survey in 4 days, working alone in the February cold with her father's tools, reading the ground in the gray winter light with the chain laid out true across frozen grass. She found the corner post and confirmed the variance. Her chain calculations matched Pruitt's method exactly, because her father had taught her the same systematic rigor that any honest surveyor's training would produce, and because ground measured honestly tells the same truth to every honest instrument. She kept her own field notes on the Section 22 work, recording each bearing and distance in the small, tight hand her father had taught her, the margins used for closure calculations. 67 links on the 3rd leg of the traverse, a slight jog east at the limestone shelf, and then the corner post rising out of frozen ground at the precise bearing and distance that Pruitt had recorded. His notes and hers agreed to within 2 chains over nearly 2 miles of traverse, which was tighter agreement than most surveyors achieved working the same ground on the same day, let alone months apart. She allowed herself a moment of professional satisfaction at that, standing over the corner post with her breath fogging in the February air, and then she finished writing up the notes and started the return traverse to close the loop. The Section 22 correction was slower, tangled as it was in a dispute between the Decker family and a land company that had purchased acreage in the section in 1877 and now found its eastern boundary in question. Nora was not a lawyer. She referred the Decker family to a solicitor in Dodge City, whose name Orville Crate supplied, and she went back to her dugout and her stove and the chain case on its shelf. She had enough money to last the winter with some left over. She had 2 paid survey commissions already inquired after for the spring, because word moved in a small county, and a woman who ran a chain correctly, charged a fair rate, and made no errors was the kind of word that moved faster than most. Pruitt's compass stayed in her coat pocket. She had written to the regimental records office in Leavenworth, asking after him, and had learned that Corporal Charles A. Pruitt had been discharged from service in September 1878 at his own request, and that his last known forwarding address was Abilene. She wrote to the postmaster in Abilene and received no answer. She thought about him sometimes, working a chain line in the February wind with the Kansas plains stretching out white and flat in every direction. She thought about a man who had run his measurements honestly and written his findings down, and then found the findings unwelcome, who had wrapped his calculations in 2 layers of oilcloth and buried his compass in the threshold and gone away. There was a kind of faith in that, she thought, the faith that the right thing buried would be found by the right hands. She was not sure she would have had that faith. She was not sure anyone could be certain they would. She thought about the threshold, about the care it took to bury something small in a space that small, and cover it over and press the earth flat so the surface looked undisturbed. He had buried the compass precisely in the center of the filled concavity, not deep enough to be missed by a hand pressed to the ground, but deep enough not to be found by a boot sole. She had found it in the second place she looked. Someone who didn't know where to look, or didn't know to look at all, wouldn't have found it in a season of casual visits. He had left it for a surveyor. He had left it for someone who would read the ground before they read the structure. The men matter moved through the State Surveying Board and the General Land Office across the winter and into the spring, and by April of 1879 his certification had been permanently revoked and a referral had been made to the county prosecutor in Wichita. Nora did not follow that thread. The prosecutor's work was the prosecutor's. She had done the chain work and filed the records, and the rest of it was not her territory. What she thought about was the corner posts. There were 4 sections along the Renner Township boundary that had been surveyed in the years just before men's filing, and she had a suspicion, not yet confirmed, that the corner posts might tell more than the 2 sections she had already examined. She had written to the county assessor asking for the acreage figures from the original homestead filings on those sections, and she was waiting on the reply. A surveyor who did a thing twice had likely done it more than twice. In April, when the Kansas plain greened up and the spring-fed draw on the eastern edge of the Stout claim ran clear and fast with snowmelt, George Stout drove a wagon out to the dugout and knocked at the limestone doorframe and stood in the pale morning sun with his hat in his hands. He said the corrected deed had been recorded at the county courthouse. He said he wanted to settle any debt owed for the work she had done on his behalf. She told him there was no debt. She had been paid by the county. He stood for a moment in the quiet. He said his daughter Clara was 2 years older now, and read well and was handy with figures, and that if Nora needed an assistant come spring survey season, Clara was interested in learning the chain work. Nora thought about her father at her age, and about who had handed him his first chain on a cold October morning, much like the one she had walked out of Fort Renner on, and about the cost of working alone across a full season versus the cost of teaching someone who was willing to be taught. She said she would give the girl a trial in May. George Stout put his hat back on and drove back down the east road toward the basin ground. That was now, in every record, correct. She watched the wagon until it was a small, dark shape against the green of the spring plain, and then it was gone. She stood in the dugout doorway for a time with the April air on her face and the chain case open on the plank table behind her, and the oilcloth packet on its shelf beside the stovepipe. The brass compass in her pocket had warmed to body temperature, and she took it out and opened it and held it on her palm and let the needle settle. It pointed where it always pointed. The ground out there was the same ground it had always been, waiting on the right instrument, the lines running where they had always run, the corner posts standing where they had been set. Patient as iron is patient, holding the true measure of the place for whoever came along with honest tools and time enough to read it. She had run the Section 14 chain in October. She had run Section 22 in February. The assessor's reply about the other sections was due any day now, and May was coming on fast, and there was more ground to measure than she could do in a season alone. She put the compass away and buttoned her coat and picked up the chain case and stepped out into the April morning and started down the East Road, the dew still on the grass and the plain waking up around her all the way to the horizon. If you have ever known what it is to be shown the door of a place you built and to walk out carrying more than they understood you were taking, you know something of what Nora held in that coat pocket. Leave a word about it below if you do. There are more stories like this one waiting, and we will return with another soon.